Today I'll be ranking the US states based on how spooky they are. It's October, it's almost Halloween, it's the spooky season, and this is a completely subjective tier list. When I say spooky, I don't mean states that are scary, states where you would be afraid to live in them. When I say spooky, I'm talking about states that have a sense of whimsical eeriness. Uh, like Halloween spooky. And the criteria for ranking these states is basically how many urban legends does a state have? Uh, how much forest cover does the state have? States that are heavily forested have more of a spooky, a spooky vibe. States that have a highly urbanized population are not very spooky. Uh, but states that have a very small population and extremely rural very sparse population, like Wyoming, for example, or Alaska, would also not be very spooky because they don't have enough of a population and enough of a recorded history for there to be a lot of urban legends about them. States that are highly forested, states that have a rural population but a large enough population that they have a lot of urban legends about them, and states that have a long recorded history are typically the spookiest. So let's start with the first state, Texas. Now, Texas, for a long time, was a largely rural state, but now it's pretty heavily urbanized. Texas does have a long history, but it's not a heavily forested state. The eastern parts of Texas have forests, but a lot of the history of Texas is centered around the time when it was a Spanish colony, and then when it was part of Mexico, and then the Mexican American Wars. So Texas, I think, would be middle of the road, C tier. Actually, B tier. Texas has enough of a history and enough urban legends surrounding the state that it's sufficiently spooky, but it's not in the top two tiers. Washington D.C. is not a state, but it has a very long history. It's extremely urbanized. Washington D.C. is extremely urbanized, and it's very small, and it doesn't have a large population. It's basically a city, so it would rank in D tier. It has enough of a history that there are probably enough urban legends around it that, and I know some people will say, oh, Washington D.C. well, Washington D.C. is spooky because political corruption or whatever. But yeah, it's not classic Halloween spooky. So I'm putting it in D tier. But it has enough of a history, enough urban legends that it doesn't go in F tier. Tennessee. So Tennessee is a heavily forested state. It's a very rural state, but it has a large enough population that there are plenty of urban legends around it. It's a pretty old state. Um, yeah, Tennessee I think would go in A tier. I might move it up to S tier if there aren't enough states in S tier, but for now it's going in A tier. Tennessee is pretty spooky. South Carolina. So South Carolina is a southern state. It has a long history, long recorded history. All states in the deep South have kind of a slightly dark history, no pun intended, due to slavery, and and then also like before the Civil War, the South had this very like aristocratic, like upper class. There were a lot of great American writers and poets from the South. There's also a lot of American ghost stories from the South. And yeah, obviously, the deep South is a heavily forested region. It has a lot of history. So I think Tennessee is also going, or sorry, South Carolina is also going in A tier. Nevada. Nevada is not heavily forested. It doesn't have a very long recorded history, of course, by like Europeans, or European colonizers. Obviously, Native Americans have lived in this region for probably over 10,000 years. Between 10,000 and 15,000 years. But yeah, but the recorded history of Nevada is not that long. It it doesn't have. I don't think it has that many urban legends about it, and yeah, it's not. It doesn't have a spooky vibe. A lot of this is just going to be based off of vibes. As much as I hate that word, I think it's going in D tier along with Washington D.C. Virginia is a very old state. It has a lot of recorded history. It's a heavily forested state, and it has a lot of urban legends. And it's yeah, I think it's going in A tier. Rhode Island. Rhode Island is a very small state. It's very urbanized. It's but part of New England. New England is a heavily forested region with a lot of history. New England definitely has a uh, spooky connotations. There's a lot of ghost stories from New England. Edgar Allan Poe. Actually, was Edgar Allan Poe from New England? I'm not sure. Yeah, but I do associate all of the states in New England are going to be ranked pretty highly. But Rhode Island will probably be ranked lower than the other states in New England. I'm putting it in B tier along Texas. New England in general, the states in the northeastern U.S. are all going to be ranked as very spooky, but I think Rhode Island is the lowest. All the other New England states are going to be ranked higher than Rhode Island. New Mexico, like Nevada, New Mexico it's moderately urbanized. It doesn't have a lot of forests. It's kind of the history. It does have a long history, but it was mostly like Spanish missions and in terms of how long it's been a part of the United States, it's not that old. New Mexico has some urban legends, like the Roswell incident, but I'm gonna rate it in D tier as not particularly spooky. Ohio. So Ohio is a state with it's a very populated state. It's one of the most or it's one of the states with the highest population density in the U.S. And it's also a very rural state. A lot of the population of Ohio is spread out across the state. It has a lot of forests and farmland. Uh, Ohio is also pretty old, and it definitely has spooky connotations in terms of U.S. states. So I'm going to put it in A tier, along with Tennessee, South Carolina, and Virginia. Iowa. Iowa is a Midwestern state. It's very rural. It has a population that's spread out across the state, much like Ohio. It's not quite as old. It doesn't have quite as much forest cover, I don't think. I think the state is like mostly agricultural. A lot of the state is fields. It's fields of corn, soybeans, and other crops that are farmed at a large scale. But being part of the Midwest, it does have some spooky connotation. I'm going to put it along with Texas and Rhode Island for now. I might move it up to A tier. All right, Nebraska. Nebraska is in the middle of the country. It's a very flat state, doesn't have a lot of forests. It's mostly agricultural. It has a large rural population in terms of the percentage of the state that lives in rural areas, but it doesn't have a lot of urban legends. It's not quite that old. I'm not sure if it was part of the Louisiana Territory or not, but yeah, I'm putting it in C tier just because Nebraska doesn't have a lot of spooky connotations. Connecticut. Now, Connecticut is a New England state, one of the oldest states. It's heavily forested. It's also pretty urbanized, but because of the amount of forest cover and the amount of history that the state has, yeah, Connecticut is also a pretty dark state. I mean, the winters are not very cold, but they're very long and very dark. And yeah, the history that the state has, the lore that the state has, I think puts it in A tier. West Virginia. I think we've got our first S tier state. West Virginia is extremely forested. It's pretty old. It does have a lot of history. It has a lot of urban legends. It is yeah, it is quintessentially a spooky state. West Virginia is solidly an S tier. New York. Now, New York is an old state. New York is also heavily forested. A lot of the population is urbanized, though. I think like half the population or something like that lives in the city of New York and the suburbs and the regions around the city of New York. But given how old the state is, the fact that it's in the northeastern U.S., yeah, and the urban legends surrounding it, I'm gonna put I'm not sure. It either goes in B tier or A tier. Um, I'm gonna put it in B tier for now because of the associations that state has are not particularly spooky. Kind of like Texas. New York and Texas both have a lot of urban legends, large population. Uh, However, the connotation that the states have in the mind of the typical American is not very spooky. Arkansas. Arkansas definitely goes in A tier. Arkansas is a very rural state, a lot of forest cover, a lot of urban legends. It's sufficiently old as far as American states go. Yeah, Arkansas is definitely a spooky state. New Jersey. All right, this is another northeastern state. It's one of the most urbanized states in the U.S. So New Jersey doesn't go. Yeah, I'm putting it. I'm putting it in C tier. I'm actually. Yeah, it's not in New England. Rhode Island ranks above New Jersey. New Jersey is, I think, the most urbanized state in the U.S. I think the majority of the people in New Jersey actually live in suburbs of larger cities. Um, and I know it's a very old state, and there's a lot of urban legends associated with New Jersey, but it doesn't have a particularly spooky connotations as far as U.S. states go. Idaho is a very rural state. Idaho has quite a bit of forest cover, although it's not among the most heavily forested states. Idaho could rank in A tier if it was older. If Idaho had more history, it could rank in A tier along with Tennessee, Ohio, Connecticut, Arkansas. But it's going to go in B tier for now. It has the potential to be spooky, but it just doesn't have a lot of it doesn't have enough lore around surrounding the state. Kansas. This is another middle America, mostly agricultural state. Um, Kansas also has the potential to rank among the spookiest if it had more history and if the state was more dynamic. Like a lot of Kansas is just fields of various crops. So I'm putting it along with Nebraska. Most of the states. Oklahoma is probably going to go in C tier too. Indiana, again, another Midwestern state, a sufficient amount of forest cover. I think it ranks along with Ohio in A tier. Um, it's got it's got that history of like the wars between the Native Americans like Ohio, the French and Indian Wars. Actually, I think the French and Indian Wars were a little farther to the east, but anyway, yeah, most like upper Midwestern and eastern Midwestern states are going to rank pretty highly. Alaska. Now, Alaska is a heavily forested state. It's extremely rural. It doesn't have a lot of farmland. It has a long history of interaction between Native Americans and European settlers. However, it has a very small population. It's a relatively new state, and it doesn't have a lot of lore surrounding it. But in terms of its physical geography, Alaska is pretty spooky. Also, the winters are very long and very dark. I think due to the physical geography of Alaska alone, I'm going to have to rank it in A tier. Arizona. Arizona goes along with New Mexico. Similar situation to New Mexico. It has a long history, but the physical geography isn't particularly spooky. California. California has a large population. It's heavily urbanized. It has some forested regions. It has the mountains in the west, which are forested. It has some geography that could be considered spooky. Some natural landscapes that could be considered spooky. But due to the nature of the state, the heavy urbanization, the thing about wilderness that makes it spooky is the the people that live in the wilderness, right? The rural populations. California doesn't have a lot of rural populations. A lot of the state's population lives in major cities, and a lot of the wilderness areas of California are natural parks. Yeah, so they're mostly unpopulated and don't have a long history of human occupation, uh, other than the Native Americans, of course. Obviously, Native Americans lived there for tens of thousands of years, but they don't really have recorded history. Or not a lot of recorded history. I'm more so talking about about the states, since they joined the U.S. So California, I think California might be the first. Yeah, I'm gonna put California in F tier for now. Actually, I think I'm gonna move Washington D.C. down to F tier as well. Since it's just one city basically, I'm putting it in F tier. Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is extremely forested. It has a large rural population. It's very old, and there's a lot of urban legends surrounding the state of Pennsylvania. I think I might move it in S tier along with West Virginia. Pennsylvania is a very spooky state with very spooky connotations in the minds of the average American. Kentucky. Kentucky is another very spooky state. It's either an S tier or A tier. Uh, I'm gonna it's a heavily forested state, a very rural state. Um, I'm gonna move Tennessee in A tier, along with Ohio. I might actually move Pennsylvania down to A tier as well. I'm not sure. All right, Wisconsin. Wisconsin is it's a Midwestern state. It's in the upper Midwest. Um, it's spooky in the way that much of Canada is spooky. It's got those legends about Wendigos and uh states that have had a lot of contact between settlers and like Native American tribes have some spooky connotations. It's also pretty forested and pretty rural. Uh, I'm gonna put it in A tier. The next state is North Dakota. North Dakota is a Midwestern state. It's in the Great Plains, but unlike Nebraska and Kansas, it has a much it is a much it I think it has a lower population. Um, I think that North Dakota ranks above Nebraska and Kansas simply because of that history of contact between Native Americans and settlers, and the fact that the state is so cold and dark in the winter. It goes in B tier. Missouri. Missouri is another Midwestern state. It's kind of contested between the Midwest and the South, which are both spooky regions. The Midwest is spooky because it's cold, dark, and forested. The South is spooky because of its long history and its history of this weird aristocratic culture, poetry, literature, the fact that it's very old in terms of U.S. history. Um, and of course, the Northeast is spooky because of how old it is and how forested it is. And Missouri, being between the Midwest and the South, is going to be pretty spooky. I'm going to put it in A tier, which is this is going to upset some people because Missouri doesn't have a lot of spooky connotations, but I think that the state of Missouri is sufficiently spooky. The next state is Michigan. Michigan might actually rank in S tier. Michigan is it's a Great Lakes state. It's very dark, very forested. The natural geography of Michigan is very, very spooky. It's S tier levels of spooky, but it isn't quite as old as New England or the South. Although, yeah, it does have those legends about Wendigos. It does have those. Does have the history of you know. Yeah, yeah. I think Michigan goes in S tier. Michigan is maybe slightly spookier than Ohio. Colorado. Colorado is a relatively new state. Surprisingly, Colorado is not heavily forested. We associate Colorado with mountains, and but yeah, Colorado is not a heavily forested state. It also has a very small population, and most of the population of Colorado lives in urban areas. I think most of Colorado's population lives in cities. It doesn't have a very large or very spread out rural population with a history of urban legends. I think Colorado might go in D tier along with Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico. Next state is Maryland. Maryland is a heavily urbanized state. It's a very old state. It's a moderately dark state. It's being in the northeastern U.S. It does have a lot of cloud cover for most of the year. But being that it's a very urbanized state, it doesn't have very spooky connotations in the mind of the average American. I think Maryland is going in C tier along with New Jersey and Kansas. Massachusetts. Massachusetts is very old, very heavily forested. it has a surprisingly large rural population. I mean, the population of Massachusetts is kind of spread out. I know that Boston and the suburbs of Boston hold a large percentage of Massachusetts's population, but yeah, states that are heavily forested and don't rely heavily on agriculture uh, typically feel more spooky. Like a state like Iowa, for example, it has a large or it has a very spread out rural population, but so much of the state is covered with fields of crops, like agricultural fields, that it doesn't feel that empty. The state feels populated. Whereas states like Massachusetts, which have much more population density, a lot more people living in a much smaller area, they don't feel as populated because of the amount of trees between every. I used to live in Connecticut, and when I was a kid, and Connecticut has. Like it feels very sparsely populated because of the amount of trees that separate all of the houses, and even small towns are covered in patches of trees, like groves of oak trees and pines and maples. States like that can get away with being densely populated and still feel spooky due to the amount of forest cover and the feeling of isolation that the large amount of trees creates. So Massachusetts, I think, is going in A tier. It's not quite. It's too densely populated to be in S tier, but it has the history. It has the forest cover. It has the cold, dark climate. The next state is Oregon. Oregon, very forested. It does have that cool, dark, sort of foggy climate. Based on natural geography, actually, I think the western part of, or sorry, the eastern part of Oregon is much drier. It's not as heavily forested, but I think Oregon goes to. I think the Pacific Northwest has those legends about Bigfoots and uh, a lot of Native American legends. So I think Oregon goes in A tier simply because it's part of the Pacific Northwest. It has that spooky, like northern European type climate, the northwestern European type climate. Um, North Carolina. This is another southern state, heavily forested. It has a very long history. It's one of the oldest states in the U.S. It's got that some darker aspects of American history as well, and yeah, like the South in general, I think ranks pretty high, or the southeastern United States. I'm putting it in A tier. North Carolina goes in A tier. It's a pretty spooky state. A lot of people are moving to North Carolina now. It's becoming more urbanized, but it is still a spooky state. The next is Georgia, another deep South state. A lot of forests. The southeastern US, like east of the Appalachian Mountains, has a lot of like pine forest, which is very strange. It has a subtropical climate with a lot of rain and a lot of humidity, but a lot of the trees are actually pine trees, which is very eerie. It's a very pine trees are associated with like boreal taiga regions in the far north, states that are very cold, or regions of the world that are very cold and dry. But the American deep south along the eastern coast, near the Atlantic Ocean, uh, like North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, they have these pine forests which lie in subtropical regions and are, yeah, very lush with vegetation, uh, despite the fact that there are pine trees everywhere. Usually, pine forests have very sparse vegetation, but in the southeastern United States, you'll see pine forests with like that are uh, very rainy, lush regions, which definitely adds to the spookiness of the geography. Georgia goes in A tier. Hawaii. Hawaii might be another F tier. Hawaii is an island. It has it has strong connotations with that, with Polynesian culture, which can be spooky, and it's the indigenous culture, mixed with Western colonialism, makes a state more spooky, but I think the physical geography of Hawaii just isn't uh it's a tropical island, so it can only be so spooky. I'm gonna put it in D tier actually. It's not quite yeah, it's in the minds of the average American, Hawaii is kind of like a tropical paradise. It's not really associated with spooky phenomenon. The next state is New Hampshire. New Hampshire it's a state in New England, heavily forested. Uh, there's a few cities in New Hampshire. It's not heavily reliant on agriculture, so much of the state's geography is just forests. But it is sufficiently old, and it doesn't have a tiny population like Wyoming. So there are plenty of urban legends about New Hampshire. I think New Hampshire might rank in S tier. Yeah, I'm gonna put New Hampshire in S tier along with Michigan. Alabama. Okay, Alabama definitely A tier. It's a deep South state, very, very forested, very rural. It's got plenty of urban legends. It's got plenty of lore behind the state. It's an old state as well. Yeah, it goes in A tier. The only thing that the Deep South lacks in its geography that would make it spooky is the fact that it's warm and it's not that dark. The winters aren't that dark. But other than that, it's heavily forested, very humid. Uh, yeah, the Deep South in general has a pretty spooky climate, a pretty spooky natural geography that is only usurped by places in the far north that are colder and darker, like New England or states that border Canada. Montana. Now, Montana borders Canada. It has some forest cover. It's very rural, but it's also a relatively new state. It doesn't have a lot of lore behind it, and it's yeah the natural geography, while it's heavily mountainous, it has forests. It's also not that dark. It's kind of in between a Pacific Northwest state and the Great Plains state. I'm gonna put Montana in B tier. Minnesota is a very forested state. It has those Wendigo connotations, those Native American legends. It borders Canada. It's in the far north. It's pretty dark in the winter, very cold. Um, it has those eerie pine forests that states in the far north have, which definitely creates a spooky atmosphere. Um, I'm gonna put Minnesota in A tier. Wyoming. Wyoming is an example of one of those very sparsely populated states. It has the natural geography to be sufficiently spooky, but it doesn't have the population. It doesn't have the history. It doesn't have the urban legends. Yeah, it's a lot of isn't a lot of the state like national parks. I'm gonna put it in. Yeah, I'm putting Wyoming in C tier. It just doesn't have enough of a history of recorded habitation. Obviously, Native Americans lived there for tens of thousands of years, but it doesn't have. I'm talking about recorded history here. Uh, Washington. Washington is a Pacific Northwest state. It's got urban legends. It doesn't have a very high population, and um, it also doesn't have that many urban legends around it. But due to the natural scenery and the natural geography and the atmosphere of the state alone, I'm putting it in A tier. It's got those dark Pacific Northwest forests. It has a similar climate to like northwestern Europe, with the western coast of Scotland or Norway or Denmark. Uh, although the western or the eastern part of the state, sorry, is pretty arid. Although most of the people live in the western in the western part of the state, closer to the Pacific Ocean, which is a climate similar to northwestern Europe. Right, Delaware. Delaware is a very small, very old state. However, it's too. I think it's too small, too urbanized. Not enough wilderness area to be considered spooky. although due to how old the state is, I'm gonna put it in C tier. It's not going in the lowest tiers. It's middle of the road. It's one of the smallest states in the U.S., but due to its long history and its you know East Coast, its sort of dark, humid East Coast climate, it goes in C tier. Oklahoma. Oklahoma goes along with the other, yeah, the other Great Plains states. It has a large Native American population, but yeah, its total population isn't that big, and natural geography of the state just isn't spooky. The state doesn't have spooky connotations, although it's not doesn't rank as low as California or Washington D.C. Utah. Okay, Utah. It's got a large Mormon population. I'm not really sure how that's relevant, but it's not heavily forested. Surprisingly, a lot of Utah is pretty arid. I think I'm gonna put it along with California and Washington D.C. You don't hear a lot of spooky stories about Utah. You know what? No, for to be fair, I'm gonna put it along with Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. I'm gonna put it with the other uh, dry Rocky Mountain states. Maine. All right, Maine is gonna go in A tier. It has okay. It has the old history. It has Stephen King, right? Stephen King, the horror writer, was from Maine. I think. I might be wrong. Uh, it definitely is a spooky state with very spooky connotations, but its population is very small. I don't know if I know any urban legends about Maine. Um, so yeah, people are going to be upset that I ranked New Hampshire above Maine, but yeah, it definitely is spooky though in terms of its physical geography. It's a very dark, very cold, very forested state. You know what? I might move Maine and Kentucky up into S tier. Yeah, Maine is going in S tier, and I think I'm going to put Kentucky in S tier as well. Yeah. All right. Next state is Louisiana. Louisiana is very old. It's very heavily forested, very surprisingly dark. I mean, it's far south. It's near the Gulf of Mexico, but it's surprisingly dark, cloudy, very rainy, very humid, very lush. There's a lot of vegetation in Louisiana, and New Orleans is a very old port city. Uh, I'm old as far as United States cities go. Yeah, Louisiana is pretty spooky. It has the swamp, it has the bayou. I might put Louisiana. I no, I'm putting Louisiana in A tier. I'm absolutely not I'm not apologizing for putting Louisiana in A tier. Louisiana is definitely, it's definitely an A tier in terms of spookiness. Vermont. Um, Vermont goes along with New Hampshire. It has some pretty old cities, heavily forested. It's kind of rural. Uh, yeah, due to the natural geography alone, it should go along with New Hampshire and Maine or sorry, S tier. Vermont goes in S tier. Due to the natural geography, as well as the somewhat rural population, the very old history, it goes along with New Hampshire and Maine. Illinois. Illinois is another Midwest state. It has a sufficient amount of forest, also a pretty high amount of farmland and crop fields. It's relatively old. It's not among the oldest states, but I think it was added to the U.S. in the Louisiana Purchase. A lot of the population lives in Chicago or suburbs of Chicago. Uh, I'm not sure if I should put it in B tier along with Iowa or in A tier along with Ohio. I think Illinois it's not as spooky as Ohio, but it's spooky enough that it ranks well above Iowa. All right, the next is South Dakota. South Dakota goes along with North Dakota in B tier. It's relatively cold, dark in the winter. but it is a Great Plains state. It has a very small population, and it's mostly agricultural. It's mostly open fields. The natural geography of South Dakota is not particularly spooky. However, due to how far north it is, uh, due to how wild the geography of the state is, I'm putting it along with North Dakota. Florida. Florida is pretty old. It has a long recorded history with when it was part of the Spanish Empire. Although I don't think the Spanish did much with the state or settled much in the state. I also Florida is so far south. I think Americans also associate Florida with like tropical paradises. Although it does not rank as low as Hawaii, Florida is uh, it's spooky enough. Even the geography, the swamps, the humid forests. I think it ranks one tier above Hawaii. Florida is also heavily urbanized now, by the way. It's not like the Louisiana Bayou, right? It's not like the Deep South. Is uh, Florida is too heavily urbanized to be anywhere above C tier. Actually, I might even move it down. Nah, I think C tier is appropriate, along with Delaware and Maryland and New Jersey. Mississippi. All right, this is another Deep South state. It's still extremely rural. It actually hasn't urbanized much since like the mid 20th century. I think it's the only state that's one of the only states that's losing population. I'm not sure. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but yeah, Mississippi is, and it has a surprisingly long history too. It's along the Mississippi River. One of the borders of the state is the Mississippi River. So yeah, it definitely has an old history. It has a dark history, and it's heavily forested, very rural, with a population that's spread out throughout the state, not just concentrated in urban centers. In fact, Mississippi has very few urban centers and it's surprisingly high population, even though it's actually losing people. I believe Mississippi is losing population, but yeah, I think it goes in A tier along with Louisiana. If you like the video, leave a like. Subscribe if you want to see more. Comment which states you think are the spookiest, and I'll come out with more videos in the future.